Mark thought he had stripped Ilara of everything. He stood in the cavernous, white marble living room, a space she had designed to feel like a cloud, and delivered his verdict with the cold precision of a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb. He thought the limb was her. He didn't know that every brick in his empire, every dollar in his account, was merely on loan from the woman he was so casually discarding. He didn't know that she was not the limb, but the very ground on which his hollow castle stood. The final payment, he would soon discover, was coming due. Within 6 months, the world he believed he had built would not just crumble, it would be methodically and quietly unbuilt. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for another story. We're so glad to have you here. If you enjoy seeing arrogance get its comeuppance and quiet strength win the day, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. We love hearing from our community, so drop a comment and let us know what city or country you're watching from today. Now, let's get back to the moment it all began. 6 months earlier, the air in that white marble room was thick with the silence that follows a declaration of war. Mark adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke shirt, a nervous habit he'd developed when he was lying. "It's over, Ilara," he said, his voice a practiced, sterile baritone he usually reserved for firing underperforming employees. "Chloe and I, we're serious." Ilara sat on the edge of a custom-designed sofa, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't look at him. She looked at the seam where the polished concrete floor met the vast wall of glass overlooking the city. She had personally overseen the pouring of that concrete, ensuring it was heated from within so that it would always be warm underfoot. A small, pointless comfort now. "I see," she said. Her voice was quiet, a low hum that was immediately swallowed by the room's aggressive acoustics. Mark took her quietness for shock, for the crumbling of a weak foundation. It fed his confidence. "I've had my lawyer draw everything up. It's very straightforward. I'm keeping the penthouse, of course. The business assets are all protected in a pre-incorporation trust. The art collection is a corporate asset. The cars are leased through the company." He ticked them off like a grocer taking inventory. "You'll get the balance of our joint checking account after expenses are cleared. It should be a few $1,000s, enough to get you started somewhere." He finally looked at her, expecting tears, a pleading rage, some satisfyingly dramatic collapse. Instead, she just sat there, her posture perfect, her gaze still fixed on that seamless architectural detail. The lack of a reaction unnerved him. He needed her to be broken. It was a necessary part of his narrative, the story he was already telling himself and Chloe about the sad, passionless wife he had to escape to finally realize his own brilliance. "You have to understand, Ilara," he continued, softening his voice into a tone of patronizing sympathy. "I've built an empire. It needs a certain kind of woman to stand beside it. Someone with energy, with fire. Chloe has that. Chloe has a trust fund and a good publicist," Ilara thought, the observation landing in her mind with the dispassionate clarity of a structural analysis report. She cataloged the thought, filed it away, and kept her expression serene. "And you," Mark said, gesturing around the room as if to encompass her entire being, "you're a wonderful person, but you've lost your spark. You dabble in your little design projects, but you've never had the hunger, the drive. You were content to live in my shadow." Her shadow. He believed she lived in his shadow, like a small, pale fern beneath a great oak. He had no idea that the oak's roots were drawing every ounce of their sustenance from a hidden, underground river that was entirely hers. For 10 years, she had let him believe this. It had been easier. It had, for a time, been what she thought was love, to make herself smaller so he could feel big. A fatal miscalculation in the architecture of a relationship. Then came the final, exquisite turn of the knife. "There is one thing," he said, walking over to the bar to pour himself a scotch. The clink of the heavy crystal decanter against the glass was the only sound. My mother. She depends on the stipend I give her for her apartment. In the transition, my finances will be tied up. I won't be able to support her for a while. He swirled the amber liquid, watching it catch the light. I think it's only right that you take over the payments for her rent, as a gesture of goodwill, of decency, to show that, despite everything, you still respect this family. This was the masterstroke, he thought, the final assertion of his power. To have the woman he was leaving with nothing pay for the upkeep of the family that was casting her out. It was a perfect, closed loop of humiliation. Ilara finally turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were unreadable. He saw no anger, no pain, just a deep, unnerving calm. She considered his request. She thought of Evelyn, her mother-in-law, a woman who measured affection in carats and square footage, a woman who had, for a decade, treated Ilara with a kind of polite, dismissive condescension, as if she were a reasonably well-behaved, but ultimately uninteresting pet Mark had brought home. Paying Evelyn's rent. It was absurd. It was insulting. It was perfect. "All right, Mark," she said, her voice still quiet but now imbued with a strange, resonant finality. "I will pay your mother's rent." Mark almost choked on his scotch. He had expected a fight, a negotiation, a torrent of righteous fury. Her immediate, calm acceptance was more disorienting than any protest could have been. He didn't understand it, so he categorized it as weakness, as the pathetic, grasping gesture of a woman trying to hold on to any connection to the life she was losing. "Good," he said, recovering his composure. "I'm glad you're being sensible." Ilara stood up, her movements fluid and deliberate. She was not a tall woman, but she held herself with a poise that gave her presence. "Is there anything else?" "No," he said, suddenly eager for her to be gone. Her placid dignity was like a mirror he didn't want to look into. "I'll have the papers sent to you. You should find a lawyer, I suppose, though there's not much to contest." "I'm sure you're right," Ilara said. She walked toward the grand entryway, her footsteps silent on the marble floor. She didn't look back at the room, at the life she had supposedly lost. When the heavy, silent door clicked shut behind her, Mark felt a surge of triumphant relief. It was done. He was free. He had won. He drained his glass, the expensive scotch tasting like victory. He had left her with nothing but a final, humiliating duty. He was a king in his castle, secure on his throne. It never occurred to him to wonder who had designed the throne, built the castle, and owned the deed to the land. Ilara's new apartment was an exercise in monastic simplicity. It was a one-bedroom in a clean, unremarkable building on the other side of town, a world away from the gleaming steel and glass spire where Mark still slept. The walls were a soft, neutral gray. The furniture was minimal, functional, and beautiful in its unadorned utility. To any of Mark and Ilara's former friends, it would have looked like a tragic, pitiable downgrade, a fall from grace. For Ilara, it was a sanctuary. It was a space that was entirely her own, unburdened by the weight of pretense. Here she was not Mrs. Mark Sterling, the quiet, artistic wife of a real estate magnate. She was just Ilara. 1 week after the conversation that had severed her marriage, she sat at a simple wooden desk overlooking a small, tidy park. The late afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. On the desk lay a checkbook, a pen, and a single crisp envelope addressed to Mrs. Evelyn Sterling. She uncapped the pen, its tip hovering over the paper. The amount was $2,800, a significant sum for someone supposedly left with only a few thousand to her name. She remembered the day Evelyn had moved into that apartment. Mark had thrown a small party. "Only the best for my mother," he had announced, puffing out his chest. He'd made a grand show of presenting Evelyn with the keys, taking all the credit for the apartment's spectacular views and high-end finishes. He had conveniently forgotten that it was Ilara who had found the listing, Ilara, who had negotiated the price with the building management, and Ilara, who had spent a month overseeing a minor renovation to make it more accessible for Evelyn as she aged. Writing the check felt strange. It was a physical manifestation of her humiliation, a monthly reminder of Mark's cruelty and Evelyn's complicity. Her fingers tightened on the pen. The anger was there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. It would be so easy to tear up the check, to write a scathing letter, to simply refuse. That was the reaction Mark expected. It was the reaction he wanted. It would confirm his narrative of her as emotional and weak. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath. She pictured the situation not as a domestic drama, but as a complex structural problem. Mark had designed a system to humiliate her. Refusing to participate was one option, but it was a reactive one. A better one was to operate within the system he had created, to use its own components against it. This monthly check was not a burden. It was a tool. It was a message. To Mark, it would say, "I am so beaten that I will do even this." To herself, it would say, "I am so strong that I can endure even this." With a steady hand, she filled out the check. Ilara Vance Sterling. She signed her full name, a name she hadn't used in years, a small act of reclamation. She folded it, slid it into the envelope, and sealed it. Then she reached into her handbag and pulled out another object. It was a small, heavy key made of brushed nickel. It was cool to the touch. It was not a key to any place Mark had ever known about. It did not belong to their old life. It belonged to her real one. She placed the key on the desk beside the envelope. The two objects, one representing her public humiliation, the other her secret power, sat side by side. The contrast was stark. The envelope was a symbol of what she had supposedly lost. The key was the symbol of what she had always, and quietly, possessed. An hour later, Ilara stood on a bustling downtown street, looking up at a sleek, 40-story tower of black glass and steel. The building was an icon of the city's new architectural wave, bold, elegant, and uncompromising. At the base of the building, etched into a granite slab, were the words, "The Sterling Vance Tower." Below that, in smaller letters, "Headquarters of Sterling Vance Architecture." Mark believed she dabbled in architecture. He thought her degree was a quaint accessory. He had once condescendingly offered her a job designing the lobby bathrooms for one of his less prestigious buildings. She had politely declined, claiming she wasn't ready for such a big project. He had laughed. The truth was, Ilara was Sterling. The firm was hers. Vance, her brilliant mercurial partner and mentor, had retired 5 years ago, leaving her as the sole principal and owner. She had kept her name on the door out of respect, and because using S. Vance professionally provided a convenient layer of anonymity. She had founded the firm with a significant inheritance from her grandmother, a fiercely independent woman who had taught her to always have a room of her own, both literally and financially. When she married Mark, his ego had been so large, so demanding of the spotlight, that she had made a conscious choice to wall off her professional life. She told him she was a freelance consultant, taking on small, anonymous projects. It was a lie of omission, one that had grown more complex and burdensome over the years, but it had kept the peace. It had allowed him to feel like the sole architect of their success. She walked through the revolving doors. The security guard in the lobby, a large, friendly man named Arthur, smiled brightly. "Good afternoon, Miss Vance," he said. Not Miss Sterling. Here she was not an appendage of her husband. She was the source. "Good afternoon, Arthur," she replied, her voice warmer and more relaxed than it had been all week. She took the private elevator to the 40th floor. The doors opened directly into her office. It was a space that mirrored her inner world, vast, organized, and filled with light. One entire wall was a window with a panoramic view of the city. Another was covered in cork, pinned with sketches, blueprints, and material samples. In the center was a massive drafting table made of reclaimed oak. This was her real home. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Lena, greeted her with a stack of files. "The final acquisition papers for the Northbridge portfolio are ready for your signature," Lena said. "And Mr. Davies called. He said to tell you the final piece is in place." Ilara nodded, taking the files. She walked over to the great window and looked down at the city sprawling below. From this vantage point, she could see the penthouse she had once shared with Mark. It looked small from up here, insignificant. She could also see 3 other major buildings her firm had designed and Sterling Development, Mark's company, had built. Buildings he believed were the jewels in his crown. She opened the top file, the Northbridge portfolio. It was a collection of commercial debt bundled and sold by a major bank. The primary asset within the portfolio was the outstanding mortgage on the headquarters of Sterling Development. Mark's company, her company, through a blind trust, had just become his bank. She thought of the check for $2,800 sitting in the mailbox, on its way to his mother. A gesture of decency, a tool, a countdown, the first of 6. The next few months settled into a strange, bifurcated rhythm. There was Ilara's public life, the one lived in the small gray apartment, a life of quiet austerity. She shopped at the local grocery store, took the bus, and wore simple, elegant clothes that drew no attention. She was the ghost of Mark Sterling's wife, a cautionary tale whispered about at cocktail parties. Then there was her private life, lived in the black glass tower downtown, a life of immense power and meticulous strategy. Each month on the 1st, she wrote the check to Evelyn. It became a ritual. She would make a cup of tea, sit at her simple desk, and fill it out with the same steady hand. Each check felt like laying a stone on a path leading to a destination only she could see. One crisp autumn afternoon, she was sitting in a small cafe near her apartment, sketching in her notebook, when the bell above the door chimed. In walked Mark and Chloe. They didn't see her at first. They were loud, performatively in love, their laughter echoing a little too forcefully in the quiet space. Mark was wearing a ludicrously expensive watch, which he seemed to check every few minutes as if his time were more valuable than anyone else's. Chloe, draped in a cashmere shawl the color of money, clung to his arm, her eyes scanning the room for an audience. Then she spotted Ilara. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. "Mark, look," she said, her voice dripping with faux surprise. "It's Ilara." Mark turned, and for a moment, a flicker of something, guilt perhaps, or just annoyance, crossed his face. But it was quickly replaced by his usual mask of confident superiority. He steered Chloe toward Ilara's table. "Well, well," he said, looking down at her. He gestured at her small table, her single cup of coffee, her simple notebook. "Keeping busy, I see." "Hello, Mark, Chloe," Ilara said, her voice even. She didn't stand up. She didn't shrink. She simply met his gaze. "We were just coming from a site meeting," Mark boomed, ensuring the nearby tables could hear. "The pinnacle. It's going to be my masterpiece. 50 stories of pure innovation. It'll redefine the city skyline." He looked at Chloe, who gazed up at him with cartoonish adoration. "My muse has been an incredible source of inspiration." Chloe preened. She looked at Ilara's simple linen shirt. "Oh, Ilara, that's a very practical top. It's nice to see you're focusing on the essentials these days." The insult was delivered with a gentle, pitying smile. Ilara's own smile was faint, barely perceptible. "It's comfortable." Mark leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial, condescending whisper. "Listen, Ilara, if you're struggling, I know some people, some small residential firms. You could probably find some work doing kitchen renovations, that sort of thing, just to keep the lights on." The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it was almost breathtaking. He was offering her crumbs from a table she owned. He was boasting about a project, the pinnacle, that was currently the primary focus of her entire firm. He had no idea. The development company he was partnering with on the pinnacle had hired Sterling Vance Architecture, based on their portfolio. The contracts were all signed with S. Vance. He was working with two of her senior project managers, men who had been meticulously briefed by Alara herself, who were under ironclad non-disclosure agreements, and who called her every evening with a detailed report on the day's progress. Mark thought he was building his masterpiece. In reality, he was a glorified middleman on her grandest project to date. "Thank you for the offer, Mark," she said, her calm delivery making the words land with a peculiar weight. "But I'm managing." "Right," he said, straightening up, clearly bored now that she had failed to provide the drama he craved. "Well, we have reservations at Per Se. Big celebration. The financing for the Pinnacle just came through." He clapped his hands together. "Untouchable." He looked at her one last time, a final, dismissive glance that took in her simple life and found it wanting. "Take care of yourself, Alara." As they swept out of the cafe, leaving a trail of expensive cologne and self-satisfaction in their wake, Ilara took a slow sip of her coffee. It was cold. She looked down at her notebook. She hadn't been sketching a kitchen. She had been refining the load-bearing calculations for the core structure of the 50-story skyscraper he had just claimed as his own. The financing for the Pinnacle had come through, he'd said. He was right. It had. A consortium of investors had backed the project. The lead investor, a silent partner who now controlled a 40% stake in the entire venture, was a private equity firm based in Delaware. The firm was a wholly owned subsidiary of a trust. Her trust. He had called himself untouchable. A familiar chill ran down Alara's spine, the same feeling she got just before a thunderstorm. It was the thrill of potential energy, of a massive, inevitable force gathering just out of sight. He thought he was untouchable. He had no idea he was standing in the open, in the middle of a field, holding a metal rod. And she was the storm. The fourth check she wrote for Evelyn was in November. The air had turned cold, and the leaves in the small park outside her window were a carpet of brown and gold. This month, she decided to deliver it in person. She needed to see her. She needed to look into the eyes of the woman who had stood by and watched her son dismantle a decade of their lives with such casual cruelty. Evelyn lived in a pre-war building with a grumpy doorman and an ancient, rattling elevator. The apartment itself was lovely, filled with the heavy, dark wood furniture she favored. It smelled of potpourri and old resentments. Evelyn opened the door, her face tightening when she saw Alara. "Oh, it's you." There was no greeting, no warmth, just surprise curdling into annoyance. "Hello, Evelyn," Alara said, holding out the envelope. "I was in the neighborhood." Evelyn snatched the envelope from her hand as if she were afraid Alara might change her mind. She didn't invite her in. They stood in the awkward silence of the doorway. "The strata fees went up again," Evelyn said, her voice a practiced complaint. "This barely covers it. Everything is so expensive. Mark used to give me a little extra for incidentals." The implication was clear. Ilara's payment was merely adequate, not generous. "I'm sorry to hear that," Alara said, her tone neutral. Evelyn sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of martyrdom. "It's just been so wonderful seeing Mark so happy. Chloe is a breath of fresh air. She has such energy, such style. She bought me the most beautiful Hermes scarf last week, just because." She patted her perfectly coiffed gray hair. "She understands that the little things matter." The comparison hung in the air between them, sharp and poisonous. Ilara had never been a gift giver, not in that way. Her gifts had been her time, her attention, her quiet support. They were gifts that couldn't be worn or displayed, and so, in Evelyn's world, they didn't exist. "He's finally with someone who is his equal," Evelyn continued, her gaze turning sharp. "Someone who pushes him, who inspires him. It's a shame you never had Mark's ambition, Alara. You're a smart girl. You could have been something." And there it was, the core of their judgment. In their eyes, she was nothing. Her quietness was a lack of passion. Her contentment was a lack of ambition. Her refusal to engage in their constant, frantic pursuit of more money, more status, more attention, was a fundamental character flaw. The pain of the remark was duller than it would have been a year ago, but it was still there. It was the faint, phantom ache of a long-healed wound. This woman had known her for 10 years. She had seen her work, her kindness, her loyalty, and she had seen none of it. She had only ever seen her son's reflection. "I should go," Alara said softly. "I have a meeting." "Yes, well," Evelyn said, already turning to close the door. "Don't be a stranger." The words were automatic, meaningless. The door clicked shut, leaving Alara alone in the dim, quiet hallway. She stood there for a long moment. She had come here for a reason, and now she had it. The last piece of her resolve clicked into place. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. It was about the entire rotten structure they had built around him. The enabling, the sycophancy, the worship of a hollow man. It all had to come down. When she got back to her real office, the one on the 40th floor, the city lights were beginning to twinkle against the deep purple of the twilight sky. She felt a profound sense of calm. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, clear certainty. The phone on her desk buzzed. It was her direct line. She picked it up. "Elara Sterling." "Elara, it's David Davies," her lawyer. His voice was usually a placid, reassuring drone, but today it held a new note of tension. He was the only other person who knew the full scope of her plan. A kind, shrewd man who had been her family's lawyer for 30 years, he had at first been hesitant, cautioning her against what he called a path of mutually assured destruction. But she had shown him the full architecture of her strategy, the precision of her calculations. He had seen that it was not about destruction, it was about a controlled demolition. "David," she said, "what's the news?" "It's done," he said, his voice low. "The board of United Allied Bank approved the sale of the last tranche of Sterling Development's debt this morning. Our holding company was the only bidder. They were desperate to get it off their books. As of 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, you, or rather the trust, are the sole debt holder. You have total leverage. You own him, lock, stock, and barrel." Elara looked out the window. Down below, the lights of Mark's office building burned brightly. Her building. "It's all in motion, Elara," Davies continued, his voice heavy with the gravity of the moment. "The foreclosure proceedings on the corporate headquarters can be filed tomorrow. The default notices on the equipment leases can be sent. The margin call on his personal trading account, which was cross-collateralized against the business. It's all ready. We just need your final authorization." He paused. "Are you sure about this, Elara? Once we start, there is no going back. This will be final." Elara thought of Mark's smug, pitying face in the cafe. She thought of Chloe's casual cruelty. She thought of Evelyn's dismissive, disappointed eyes in the doorway. She thought of 10 years of being made to feel small, of hiding her light so his could shine brighter. She thought of the woman he had tried to create in his own narrative, the weak, pathetic, failed wife. And she thought of the woman she actually was. "Yes, David," she said, her voice as clear and hard as glass. "I'm sure. Authorize it." December arrived, blanketing the city in a thin, deceptive layer of festive cheer. For Mark Sterling, it was the season of his greatest triumph. He felt invincible, a modern-day Midas. The pinnacle project was the talk of the town, his name whispered with a mixture of envy and awe in all the right circles. His life with Chloe was a glossy magazine spread come to life. All spontaneous trips to Aspen, charity galas, and champagne-fueled celebrations. He had never been happier or more certain of his own genius. The culmination of his victory lap was a lavish Christmas party held at his penthouse. The white marble palace Elara had designed was transformed. Garlands of fresh pine and eucalyptus were draped over the stark architectural lines. A towering Christmas tree, dripping with crystal ornaments, stood where Elara's favorite sculpture used to be. The air, once serene, was now thick with the competing sense of expensive perfume and the buzz of 100 simultaneous conversations. Mark stood at the center of it all, a king holding court. Chloe, shimmering in a silver sequin dress, was fused to his side. He raised a glass of champagne. "To friends," he toasted, his voice resonating with self-congratulatory warmth. "To success, and to the future, which has never looked brighter." A chorus of cheers went up. Later in the evening, a city councilman sidled up to him. "Mark, you're a marvel," the councilman slurred slightly, gesturing at the glittering crowd. "You've really done it. And that new woman of yours, Chloe, she's a firecracker." He lowered his voice. "A definite upgrade, if you don't mind me saying. Your ex-wife, Elara, she was always a bit of a wallflower, wasn't she?" Mark laughed, a deep, booming sound. "Elara is a sweet woman," he said, the magnanimity costing him nothing. "But she has no concept of this world." He leaned in, sharing a secret. "I heard she's living in some tiny walk-up across town. I feel for her, I really do. Last I heard, she was trying to get work drafting kitchen extensions for suburbanites." He chuckled. From this, he swept his arm around the opulent room, to kitchen extensions. "A bit of a fall, eh?" The councilman laughed along with him, a sycophantic cackle. They both savored the image, the satisfying narrative of the discarded wife fading into obscurity, while the great man ascended to ever greater heights. Miles away, in the quiet solitude of her 40-floor office, Elara was also looking at a kitchen extension, or rather, the plans for the executive dining kitchen on the 48th floor of the Pinnacle. She made a small notation with a red pen, refining the ventilation system. The work was meditative, calming. Her office was dark, save for the glow of the lamp on her drafting table and the glittering tapestry of the city lights outside her window. She was not at a party, she was working. But it was not the desperate scrabbling for work Mark imagined. It was the focused, methodical work of a master craftsman putting the final touches on her creation. On the polished surface of a nearby conference table, a series of documents were laid out in a precise, overlapping row. They were not architectural drawings. They were legal instruments of devastating power. The first was a notice of foreclosure on the Sterling Vance Tower, Mark's headquarters, citing chronic and deliberate default on his lease agreement. The landlord, a numbered company registered in a state he'd never heard of, was exercising its right to reclaim the property. The next was a set of liquidation orders for the assets of Sterling Development. The company's entire debt portfolio had been called in by its sole creditor. Since the company was hopelessly over-leveraged, its assets, from the fleet of leased cars to the art on the walls, were to be seized and sold off to cover a fraction of what was owed. Beside that was a margin call from a brokerage firm. Mark's personal investment account, which he'd used to fund his lavish lifestyle, was heavily leveraged against the value of his company stock. With the company about to be declared insolvent, the stock was worthless. The brokerage was demanding he cover the massive deficit in cash, immediately. And the last document, the smallest and most personal, was a formal notice of eviction. It was for the penthouse apartment he was currently celebrating in. The apartment, it turned out, was not owned by Mark. It was owned by the same family trust that had funded Elara's architectural firm, a trust established by her grandmother a half-century ago. For 10 years, Mark had lived there as Elara's husband. Now he was merely an unauthorized occupant. The notice gave him 30 days to vacate the premises. Elara gathered the documents, her movements calm and unhurried. She slid them into a simple, sturdy manila envelope. It was identical to the ones she had used to mail Evelyn's rent checks for the past 5 months. A quiet symmetry. She looked at the sealed envelope. It felt heavy in her hands, heavier than its few pages should weigh. It was the weight of 10 years of silence, the weight of 100 small humiliations, the weight of a justice that had been deferred but not denied. She placed the envelope in her briefcase. Tomorrow, she would make one final delivery. The party at Mark's penthouse would be the last happy moment of his life, as he knew it. He was celebrating on the deck of the Titanic, mistaking the sound of the iceberg scraping against the hull for the band starting a new song. The request for a meeting was delivered by a bicycle courier the following morning. It was a simple, formal note typed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock. I would like to request a meeting to discuss a final matter. Please let me know what time is convenient. Ilara. Mark read the note in his office, a slight hangover dulling the edges of his triumphal mood. He tossed it onto his desk. She wants a meeting, he said to Chloe, who was lounging on the leather sofa, scrolling through photos from the party on her phone. God, what now? Chloe sighed, not looking up. Is she going to ask for more money? It's so undignified. Probably, Mark said. She's probably realized that her little nest egg has run out, and now she has to face reality. A cruel smile played on his lips. Maybe we should go. It might be entertaining. He felt a need to see her one last time, to witness her defeat up close. It would be the final, satisfying seal on his new life. He called Evelyn. Ilara wants a meeting, all of us. I think she's going to make some sort of desperate plea. I want you there, as a witness, to show a united front. Evelyn agreed immediately. The idea of witnessing Ilara's final surrender appealed to her sense of familial loyalty and dramatic justice. They agreed to meet at 4 o'clock at Mark's office. The Sterling Vance Tower, his castle. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a piece of furniture so large it was more of a defensive fortification. He felt powerful there, enthroned. Chloe arranged herself elegantly on the sofa again, a silent, beautiful judgment. Evelyn took a stiff-backed chair, her handbag clutched in her lap like a shield. They were ready. They were a tribunal, and Ilara was the supplicant. At precisely 4 o'clock, the door opened, and Ilara walked in. She was not dressed in the dowdy, practical clothes Chloe had mocked. She wore a beautifully tailored charcoal gray suit, the kind of garment that whispers its expense rather than shouts it. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, elegant chignon. She looked poised, professional, and utterly calm. She carried a simple leather briefcase. The sight of her, so composed and confident, was not what they had expected. A flicker of unease went through the room. "All right, Ilara, what is it?" Mark began, his tone impatient, an attempt to reclaim the upper hand. "We're all very busy people. I hope this won't take long." Ilara didn't answer immediately. She walked past him and stood before the great window that overlooked the city. For a moment, she just looked out, her back to them. Then she turned. "I asked you all here to close a chapter," she said, her voice quiet but carrying an extraordinary authority that filled the room. "But to do that, we need to be clear on what was written." She began to speak, and as she did, she began to walk slowly around the room. It was not a plea, it was a lecture. It was a summation. It was the list of grievances. "On May 14th, 2 years ago," she began, her eyes on Mark, "we were at dinner with the Hendersons. You told the table that my design for the waterfront pavilion was charming but amateurish, and that you'd had to give it to a junior developer at your firm to make it viable. You failed to mention that the final design, the one that won the Civic Architecture Award, was identical to my original blueprint." Mark shifted in his chair. "I don't recall." Ilara didn't stop. She turned her gaze to Evelyn. "On my 35th birthday, Evelyn, you gave me a book, Dressing for Your Man's Success. You told me it was important for a woman to be a beautiful reflection of her husband's achievements. You said it with a smile, as if you were giving me a gift." Evelyn's face flushed. "I only meant to be helpful." Ilara's gaze returned to Mark. "For our 10th anniversary, I designed and commissioned a sculpture, a Mobius strip cast in bronze to symbolize our infinite connection. You had it moved to storage 3 weeks later because, you said, it clashed with the new sofa. The sofa Chloe had picked out." She continued, her voice never rising, never breaking. She listed a dozen more slights. The times Mark had belittled her work in public. The times he had taken credit for her ideas. The family holidays he had canceled at the last minute for a business emergency that turned out to be a golf trip. The casual, cutting remarks from Evelyn about her lack of children, her simple tastes, her failure to keep up with Mark. Each memory was delivered as a flat, incontrovertible fact. It was not an emotional outburst. It was the calm, precise testimony of a witness detailing the facts of a crime. Mark's initial annoyance had morphed into a defensive fury. "What is the point of this, Elara?" he finally exploded, slamming his hand on the desk. "Is this what this is about? A pathetic trip down memory lane? You're dredging up ancient history because you're miserable and alone? It's pathetic." Chloe nodded in agreement. "This is really beneath you, Elara." Elara stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the desk. She looked at Mark, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes other than calm. It was not anger, it was something colder. It was pity. "No, Mark," she said, "this is not about the past. It's about the present. It's about establishing a pattern of behavior, a pattern of taking, of belittling, of underestimation." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "And every month for the last 6 months," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "I have sent your mother a check for her rent. A gesture of decency, you called it." She looked at Evelyn, whose face was now a mask of confused apprehension. "A duty." Elara reached into her briefcase and pulled out the manila envelope. She placed it gently on the polished surface of Mark's desk. It landed with a soft, final sound. "This," she said, "is the last payment." Mark stared at the envelope. He saw it as the ultimate symbol of his victory, of her subjugation. A smug, triumphant smile returned to his face. He thought this was her final, dramatic gesture of surrender. He picked it up, feeling its thinness. "Finally coming to your senses, are you?" he sneered. "Realize you can't afford it anymore?" He ripped the envelope open with a flourish, expecting to find a final check, perhaps accompanied by a tear-stained letter. Instead, his eyes fell upon the stark, black-and-white legalese of the first document. His brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this? Notice of foreclosure? This is a mistake. I own this building." Elara said nothing. She simply watched him. He frantically pulled out the other documents. Liquidation orders. A margin call notice from his brokerage. His face, which had been flushed with arrogant confidence, was rapidly draining of all color. He looked like a man who had been stabbed but hadn't yet registered the pain. He kept shuffling the papers, his mind refusing to assemble the pieces. This is insane. It's a prank. Who is the Kestrel Group?" he muttered, reading the name of the creditor on the documents. "I've never even heard of them." Then Elara spoke. Her voice was still quiet, but it sliced through the room like a shard of ice. It was the quiet bomb. "Kestrel is a type of falcon," she said conversationally. "My grandmother loved them. She said they were small, often overlooked, but brilliant hunters." She paused. "The Kestrel Group is the holding company for the Vance Family Trust. My trust, Mark." The information did not compute. Mark just stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. Chloe had stopped looking at her phone. Evelyn leaned forward in her chair, her knuckles white where she gripped her handbag. "The holding company that just acquired all of Sterling Development's debt from the banks?" Elara continued, her voice calm and instructional, as if explaining a difficult concept to a child. "The one you've been desperately trying to get a meeting with for 2 months? That's me." Silence. A profound, ringing silence. The only sound was the rustle of paper as Mark's trembling hands shuffled the documents again, his eyes scanning them wildly, looking for an escape clause that didn't exist. "The lead architect on your Pinnacle project," Elara went on, delivering the next blow. "The mysterious S. Vance you've been praising in every meeting? You never thought to ask what the S stood for, did you? It stands for Sterling. Sterling Vance Architecture. Vance was my mother's maiden name. The firm is mine, Mark. It has always been mine. Chloe made a small, strangled sound. She was looking at Mark, but her expression was no longer adoring. It was the horrified look of someone realizing they had pinned all their hopes on a fraud. Ilara saved the final, most devastating revelation for last. She gestured around the magnificent office, at the view, at the very foundations of the building. And this tower? The one with your name on it? You don't own it. You never did. She let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow. You have a 99-year commercial lease on the building, a lease held by my family's trust. You have been in default on that lease for the past 3 months, ever since you stopped transferring funds to our joint account, the account I used to pay the lease. I just didn't feel it was my responsibility anymore. She looked directly at him, her eyes holding his. The sea storm gray was now the color of cold, hard granite. The eviction notice for your penthouse is also in that envelope. That property also belongs to the trust. You have 30 days to vacate. Mark finally broke. A choked, guttural sound escaped his throat. He lunged for the phone on his desk. My lawyer! I'll call my lawyer! This is illegal! You can't do this! His voice was high-pitched, cracking with panic. Go ahead, Mark, Ilara said, her tone utterly devoid of emotion. Call him. Have him review the contracts you signed. The ones you never bothered to read the fine print on. The ones I drafted. You'll find they are, as you once said about our divorce settlement, very straightforward. She looked at him, a man who had seemed like a giant just 10 minutes ago, now shrunken and flailing behind his ridiculous desk. You left me with nothing, Mark. That was your parting line. But the truth is, you never had anything to give. You built your kingdom with my money, in my buildings using my designs. You were a tenant, and your lease has expired. The immediate aftermath was a symphony of disintegration. Mark, his face a ghastly shade of gray, succeeded in getting his lawyer on the phone. His voice, usually so commanding, was a frantic, pleading squeak. Ilara could hear the tinny, dispassionate replies from the other end of the line. Phrases like ironclad, no recourse, and perfectly legal drifted across the room. Chloe was a study in panicked self-preservation. The mask of the adoring muse had vaporized, revealing the cold, calculating opportunist beneath. She wasn't looking at Mark with sympathy. She was looking at him with the contempt one reserves for a bad investment. The sequin dress that had looked so glamorous at the party now seemed cheap and tawdry in the harsh afternoon light. She silently stood up, picked up her designer handbag, and without a single word or a backward glance at the man whose life was imploding, walked out of the room. The quiet click of the door was her verdict. But the most compelling reaction came from Evelyn. She sat frozen in her chair, her gaze fixed on Ilara. The confusion and apprehension had coalesced into a dawning, terrifying clarity. It was the look of someone who has been playing checkers and has just been informed that the game was, in fact, chess, and they were checkmated 10 moves ago. Every condescending remark, every piece of patronizing advice, every moment she had sided with her son's glittering success over Ilara's quiet substance. It all replayed in her mind, but now cast in a horrifying new light. She hadn't been punching down at a weak, unfortunate victim. She had been taunting the executioner. Slowly, shakily, Evelyn rose to her feet. She took a hesitant step toward Ilara. Ilara, she began, her voice a dry whisper. Please, he's my son. Don't do this to him. Ilara finally turned her full attention to the older woman. For the first time, a flicker of the old pain, the pain Evelyn had so carelessly inflicted, showed in her eyes. And I was your daughter, she said, her voice soft but unforgiving. For 10 years I was your daughter. When he threw me out with nothing, where was your plea then? When you told me I could have been something, did you ever stop to consider what I already was? Evelyn flinched as if struck. She had no answer. There was no answer. Ilara's gaze shifted back to Mark, who had just dropped his phone back into its cradle, his hand falling away as if it had been burned. He stared into the middle distance, his face utterly blank with shock. The king was dethroned. The castle was dissolving around him. "This isn't about revenge, Mark," Ilara said, her voice pulling him back from the abyss of his shock. He looked at her, his eyes hollow. "This is a correction, a restoration of balance. You built a world based on a lie, the lie of your own genius and my insignificance. I'm simply revealing the truth." She picked up her briefcase. Her work here was done. "The liquidation team will be here in the morning to take possession of the corporate assets. A representative from the trust will be in touch about vacating the penthouse." She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. "You built your kingdom on my foundations," she said, delivering the final, quiet summation. "Did you really think I'd let you keep it after you tried to burn me to the ground?" She didn't wait for an answer. She walked out, leaving behind the ruins of a man, his bewildered mother, and the profound, crushing silence of absolute defeat. The air in the hallway outside was cool and clean. She took a deep breath. It was the first breath she had taken in 10 years that was entirely, completely her own. The weeks that followed were a quiet, methodical dismantling. The news of Sterling Development's spectacular collapse sent a shockwave through the city's business community. The story, as pieced together by financial reporters, was one of reckless over-leveraging and hubris. Mark Sterling was painted as a charlatan, a man who had flown too close to the sun on wings made of debt. No one knew the full story. No one knew the name of the architect of his downfall. Ilara's name, or rather the name of her trust, was buried deep in layers of legal entities. Publicly, the world only saw the rise of a brilliant, enigmatic architect known as S. Vance, whose firm had seamlessly taken over the stalled Pinnacle project and was now pushing it forward with breathtaking efficiency. Ilara did not move back into the penthouse. She did not claim Mark's corner office. She remained in her simple, gray apartment. She continued to take the bus. The external trappings of wealth had never been the point. The point was sovereignty. Mark's fall was as swift as it was brutal. The penthouse was lost. The cars were repossessed. The friends who had toasted his success vanished like mist. Chloe, it was rumored, was already attached to another, more solvent titan of industry. Mark was forced to move into a small, bleak rental apartment in a part of town he used to fly over in a helicopter. The king was in exile. But the most significant story was not Mark's. It was Evelyn's. Stripped of the reflected glory of her son's success, she was left with a stark choice. She could cling to the wreckage of her son's life, becoming a bitter, resentful woman, or she could face the truth she had spent a decade avoiding. A month after the confrontation, Evelyn did something that required more courage than she had shown in years. She took a bus to the other side of town. She stood outside Ilara's unremarkable building, took a deep breath, and rang the buzzer. Ilara opened the door and saw her former mother-in-law standing there, looking smaller and older than she ever had before. She was not wearing her usual armor of expensive jewelry and perfectly tailored clothes. She wore a simple cloth coat. She looked diminished. "May I come in?" Evelyn asked, her voice fragile. Ilara hesitated for a second, then stepped aside. Evelyn walked into the simple, calm apartment. Her eyes took in the minimal furniture, the lack of ostentation. She had once pitied Ilara for this life. Now she saw it for what it was. A life of chosen simplicity, not enforced poverty. It was the life of someone who needed to prove nothing. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Evelyn spoke, her words halting, each one seemingly costing her a piece of her long-held pride. "I was wrong," she said, her gaze fixed on her own hands, which were twisting a handkerchief in her lap. "Everything I said, everything I did, the way I treated you, I was wrong." She looked up and Ilara saw that her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. I was so blinded by Mark's shine, the money, the success. I thought that's what mattered. I thought that's what strength looked like. I never saw your strength, the quiet kind, the real kind. She took a ragged breath. I enabled him. I encouraged his worst instincts. I was so proud of the man I thought he was. I refused to see the man he was actually becoming. And I was cruel to you, because you were a mirror. You reflected everything that wasn't shiny and loud, and it made me uncomfortable. It was a confession, a full, unvarnished admission of her own moral failure. Ilara listened, her expression unreadable. She had expected anger, recriminations, pleading. She had not expected this raw, painful honesty. The rent checks, Evelyn whispered. You kept sending them, even when you didn't have to. Why? It was never about the money, Evelyn, Ilara said softly. It was a test. It was a monthly question I was asking. The question was, do you see me? Do you have any decency, any gratitude, any humanity left? Every month your coldness, your complaints, your praise for Chloe, it was the answer. And the answer was always no. Evelyn closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. I failed, she said simply. A long silence settled between them. Ilara could have said, yes, you did. She could have listed every failure. She had earned that right. But looking at the broken woman before her, she saw no victory in causing further pain. Her battle was with the arrogance, not the person trapped beneath it. Mark lost his empire because he was a bad businessman and a cruel man, Ilara said finally, her voice gentle but firm. You lost a daughter because you valued status over character. She stood up and went to her desk. She came back with an envelope. It was not a rent check. It was a legal document. This is from the trust, Ilara explained. It's an annuity. It will pay the rent on your current apartment for 1 year. After that, it will stop. Evelyn looked at her stunned. But why? Because my grandmother who built the trust was a decent woman, and she believed in second chances, Ilara said. This isn't a gift from me. I cannot give you that. It is the final, decent act of a family that no longer exists. It's a foundation. What you build on it is up to you. This act was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the line between justice and vengeance. Justice was taking back what was stolen. Vengeance was salting the earth afterward. Ilara chose justice. She offered not forgiveness, but a path toward it. A year of grace. A chance for Evelyn to rebuild her life on a foundation of humility rather than pride. Evelyn took the envelope with a trembling hand. Thank you, she whispered. It was the first time she had ever thanked Ilara for anything, and meant it. 6 months later, spring had returned to the city. Ilara stood on the 48th floor of the Pinnacle, which was now a skeleton of steel reaching for the sky. The air was filled with the sounds of construction, the roar of machinery, the shouts of workers, the clang of metal on metal. To her, it was music. She was wearing a hard hat and a simple practical jacket. Her name, Ilara Sterling, was stenciled on the front of the hat. She had finally reclaimed it. Her firm, now openly known as Sterling Architecture, was thriving. She was no longer a secret. She was a force. Looking out from the unfinished floor, she could see the entire city spread out before her. Her victory had not brought her a giddy rush of triumph. It had brought her a deep, abiding sense of peace. She had not destroyed a man. She had dismantled a destructive illusion. She had surgically removed a cancer from her own life, and in the process had exposed the rot in the system that had allowed it to grow. The justice she had enacted was poetic. Mark, who worshipped appearances, was now invisible. Evelyn, who prized status, was now learning to live with simple dignity. One afternoon, Ilara was in a bookstore, browsing the architecture section, when she saw him. Mark was stocking shelves. He wore the drab uniform of the store, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn. He looked 10 years older. He moved with the slow, defeated shuffle of a man who had lost his purpose. He didn't see her. He was arranging a display of books. The featured title was a glossy new coffee table book, The New Modernists, 21st Century Architectural Visionaries. On the cover was a striking photo of a woman standing before a bold, elegant skyscraper. The woman was Elara Sterling. Mark froze. He stared at the cover, his hand hovering over the stack of books. He picked one up, his fingers tracing her name. Elara watched as his face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and then finally a flicker of profound, devastating understanding. The scale of the woman he had discarded, the sheer magnitude of his underestimation, crashed down on him in that silent, fluorescent-lit aisle. He finally saw her. It was too late, but he saw her. Elara turned and walked away without a word. There was nothing left to say. Her life was not about him anymore. It was about the clean lines of a new design, the satisfaction of a problem well solved, the quiet joy of a cup of tea in her own sun-filled apartment. She had faced humiliation with dignity, wielded immense power with integrity, and administered justice with grace. She had learned that true strength isn't about how loudly you proclaim your worth, but how quietly you inhabit it. True worth is not a performance, it is a foundation. And on that foundation, she was building a beautiful life, one carefully designed piece at a time. The world is full of people who will try to define you, to make you smaller, to fit you into a box that serves their own narrative. But your value is not determined by their perception. It is inherent. It is the quiet, unshakable foundation upon which you build your own life. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to let them underestimate you while you quietly, patiently build your own empire. What did you think of Elara's story? Have you ever been in a situation where someone completely underestimated you, only to be proven wrong? We would love to hear your story in the comments below. It's always so inspiring to hear how members of our community have overcome challenges with strength and grace. And if you found this story as satisfying as we did, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more tales of justice and vindication. Thank you for being here with us today. We'll see you in the next story.